Gordon Ramsay is famous for two things. The first is his skills as a chef. See, Chef Ramsay has a total of 8 Michelin stars over several restaurants throughout the world. He has several over in England and even several here in the United States, one of which is in downtown Naperville called Ramsay's Kitchen. He is famous for presenting his signature dish, beef Wellington, to so many different places around the world. The second thing he's famous for is his colorful language. If you ever watch any of his shows, you would know that, well, he likes to swear a lot. Let's just put it that way, just put it blatantly. If you ever watch his famous TV show, Hell's Kitchen, you know the type of language he uses. Another one of his famous shows is called Kitchen Nightmares. This is a show where Gordon Ramsay goes to various struggling restaurants throughout the United States. He helps them with the menu, with decorations, and even the attitude of the owners. He helps the restaurant get back on its feet. Within a few days, the restaurant goes from being a disaster to a success. However, there are some times we don't know what happens with these restaurants after the credits roll on that particular episode. And so Ramsay decided to have a few episodes where he would show the restaurant after maybe a year or some time of being away from the restaurant and just to see how it's doing. Some of the restaurants would grow and be thriving, no longer needing Ramsay's help to continue on. But there's some restaurants that would either go back to their old ways or even shut down. Some of the owners would even say that their old ways were far better than much better than Gordon Ramsay's. Now, if I had owned a restaurant, I would probably listen to the man who has 8 Michelin stars and several successful restaurants throughout the world, and even is a host for multiple cooking shows. But sometimes pride or just simple laziness takes over. And today we're going to be looking at how the people of Jerusalem slip back into their old habits. We are finally at the end of the study of Nehemiah. We are at the last chapter, chapter 13. I know this has been a very long and difficult study, but we are finally here at the end, the final chapter. And with this particular chapter, we see that Nehemiah leaves. He goes back to his old job, which anyone know what his job was before coming to Jerusalem? Anyone remember? He was the cupbearer for the king Artaxerxes. And so at the beginning of the book in Nehemiah chapter 1, we see Nehemiah. He was working as the cupbearer, and then his brother, as well as some other people from Jerusalem, came and told him about the issues of Jerusalem with the walls and the people. And so then Nehemiah eventually asked the king, "Hey, can I go and help Jerusalem out, restore the city back to its old ways, to make it a healthy and thriving city, and then I'll come back and I'll come back and continue my job." And so that's what Nehemiah did. He goes back to the king, King Artaxerxes, and serves as the cupbearer. And so now let's take a look here in Nehemiah 13. And so it starts off in verse 1, where we see the reading of the book of Moses. That's our first point here today. And so at the beginning, it says, "On that day, the book of Moses was read aloud in the hearing of the people, and it was found written that no Ammonites or Moabite should ever be admitted into the assembly of God, because they had not met the Israelites with food and water, but had hired Balaam to call a curse down on them. Our God, however, turned the curse into a blessing. When the people heard this law, they excluded from Israel all who were of foreign descent. And so then, if the people who are Moabites or Ammonites, they were not allowed to be in the assembly of God. They were not allowed to be there in Israel. They were sworn enemies of Israel. And so now, Moab and Ammon, those were nations that were east of the Jordan River. And so, and just a little extra context, if you remember the famous story of Ruth, that book, Ruth was a Moabite. So that's where she was from. And so just that's a little extra context there. But yeah, Moabites, Ammonites, they were not welcomed. They were not allowed into the assembly of God. And so when the people of Jerusalem saw that they were not allowed to be there, they said, okay, we got to follow this. Let's do this. Let's get rid of them. Let's have them go out of the city. Now, I encourage you to study more about Ammon and Moab to know more. They were originally the descendants of Lot's daughters, and you can know more about that in Genesis chapter 19. And you can even know more about why these nations were not allowed in the assembly of God in Numbers 22 and 20 through 24. But today we're going to go into more of the people of Jerusalem when Nehemiah was away and what Nehemiah found when he returned. So now going into the main section of our passage, we're starting off with verses 4 through 14, which is neglecting the temple. We see that people of Jerusalem were neglecting the temple. So we'll start off in verse 4 here. It says, before this, Elisha, the priest, had been put in charge of the storerooms of the house of our God. He was closely associated with Tobiah, and he had provided him with a large room formerly used to store the grain offerings and incense and temple articles, and also the tithes of grain, new wine, and oil, prescribed to the Levites, singers, and gatekeepers, as well as the contributions for the priest. So before I continue on, we see that Elisha, he was a priest put in charge of the storerooms. Now, as a little extra context, if you remember the last few weeks, we talked about the use of these storerooms. These were meant to be used as for the tithing, with the grain offerings, with the incense, with all the stuff that the Levites were going to be able to have. This was the tithing that the people would give to the Levites, and this would be for the Levites, so then they wouldn't have to go back to work or anything, that they can focus on the ministry of the temple. But Elisha, a priest, then said, well, instead of that, I'm going to take out all the grain offerings. I'm going to take out the stuff that was meant for the Levites, and I'm going to let my relative Tobiah to take one of these storerooms. And it wasn't like he took it as like a little lounge area in a way. He used it as like a little apartment area. That's where he lived in. So not only was this area being used for something that it wasn't supposed to, but on top of it, Tobiah, he's an Ammonite. And we know this early on in this section. Tobiah, he's an Ammonite. And we just learned that Ammonites are not allowed to be in the assembly of God. They were not allowed in the city. Plus, Tobiah, if you remember that name from early on in this series, Tobiah, what did he try to do to Nehemiah? Anyone remember? He was one of the people who tried to kill Nehemiah because Nehemiah was building the walls. So using a storeroom that was not meant to be used, but giving it to an Ammonite who was not allowed to be there, and an enemy of Nehemiah. So a lot of issues are already starting to take place here. And so then moving on into verse 6, it says, but while all this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem. This was again Nehemiah. For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I returned to the king. Sometime later, I asked his permission and came back to Jerusalem. Here I learned about the evil thing Elisha had done in providing Tobiah a room in the courts of the house of God. I was greatly displeased and threw out all of Tobiah's household goods out of the room. I gave orders to purify the rooms, and then I put back into them the equipment of the house of God with the grain offering and the incense. So we see Nehemiah. He spent some time away, let them do their own thing. It's trying to make sure that they can function without him there. So Nehemiah comes back. He finds Tobiah living in one of these storerooms. And he's so upset, so angry that he throws out all of Tobiah's stuff. Now, when I'm saying that Nehemiah was angry, that's an understatement. See, Nehemiah was outraged. He was very upset, very outraged over what he was seeing. This honestly, looking at this reminded me of how Jesus was when he came into the temple courts. And if you remember in John chapter 2, as well as Matthew 21, Jesus comes into the temple courts and he flips over the money tables. He releases all the animals and creates almost like a stampede. Like Jesus did that twice. He did that at the beginning of his ministry and did it at the end. So at the beginning, that was in John chapter 2, and at the end, that was Matthew chapter 21. But that type of anger, that type of outrageous anger from Jesus is kind of like that same thing that we see from Nehemiah here. He is upset. He is outraged. It's like, how dare you do this to the house of God? Takes Tobiah's stuff and throws it out. And he says that Tobiah, he defiled this storeroom, that he had to get this room purified. He had people come in. It's like, hey, we got to purify this room right now. And then he was able to put back all the stuff that was meant to be there, all the equipment of the house of the Lord with the grain offerings and the incense. He put it back to what it was meant to be used for. It wasn't meant to be a little apartment. It was meant to store all the incense, all the grain offerings for the Levites. But now we're going to be moving on with this same section of what happened with the Levites and singers, starting in verse 10. I also learned that the portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them, and that all the Levites and singers responsible for the service had gone back to their own fields. So I rebuked the officials and asked them, why is the house of God neglected? Then I called them together and stationed them at their posts. So just stopping there right now. So we see that the Levites and singers had to go back to their fields because the portions, the tithes that were meant to be for them were not being given to them, almost like they'd just been stopped. And so the Levites and the singers had to go back to their fields, as in they had to become bivocational pastors. They were forced to do this. Now, we understand that today there are churches that they just can't afford a pastor with a full-time salary, like a livable salary. And so, like myself, have to go get another job just to bring food on the table. And it's understandable. Sometimes the finances just doesn't work. But in this particular case, it was that the people decided, nah, we're just not going to do it. It was the Levites and the priests, they were neglected. And so they had to go out to the field and provide food for their families. And then continuing on in verse 12, all Judah brought the tithes of grain, new wine, and oil into the storerooms. And so now Nehemiah, he brought things back. He was able to put the storerooms back to the way that they were meant to be, just like as they were before he left. And starting verse 13, he has several people that he put in charge that were trustworthy. So he no longer was Elisha, that guy that gave Tobiah the storeroom as an apartment. There, he's no longer in charge. He put people in charge that he knew that were trustworthy, people that he can trust, people that would actually have responsibility over the temple. But then finally, in this section here, we see in verse 14 where Nehemiah ends with a prayer. Verse 14 says, "Remember me for this, oh my God, and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its servants." In verse 14, we see Nehemiah, he's taking this personally. I mean, it's kind of understandable on why, because Nehemiah, he's working faithfully. He's working hard for the people of Jerusalem, working hard for God to put this holy city back to a useful city. And he feels that it was almost his fault that he didn't do the proper job. But on top of all that, he was praying, God, please don't blot me out from my faithful work to you. See, some translations might use the word wipe me out instead of blot me out. Nehemiah was afraid that he was that he was not going to get the faithful credit from God, that he was not that he was going to be included in Jerusalem's sin, even though he was faithful to God. He put the city back to where it used to be, and even though he was gone during this time of rebellion, he was afraid that that he was going to be a part of this disaster, this unfaithfulness from the people of Jerusalem. And so he's saying, Lord, please don't blot me out. Please don't forget of my faithful work that I have done for the house of my God and its servants. And I wish it stopped there with the rebellion with Jerusalem, but it does not. We continue on in our next point. So we saw the neglecting of the temple, and now we see neglecting the Sabbath. This is in verses 15 through 22. Starting in verse 15, it says, "In those days I saw men in Judah trading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in grain and loading it on donkeys, together with wine, grapes, figs, and all other kinds of loads. And they were bringing all this into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Therefore, I warned them against selling food on that day. Men from Tyre who lived in Jerusalem were bringing in fish and all kinds of merchandise and selling them in Jerusalem on the Sabbath to the people of Judah." So I'm just going to stop there before we go into verse 17. So we see that people are buying and selling items on the Sabbath. They can do it on any other day, but they're doing this on the Sabbath. The Sabbath was meant to be a day of rest, a day that you should respect, you should honor, that you should take that day of rest. The hard thing is, it wasn't just one or two things that were being sold. Here's the list of different things. We see grain, wine presses, grapes, figs, and all different kinds. And then in verse 16, we see fish being sold, as well as all kinds of merchandise. So it wasn't a couple of things here and there. It was pretty much another market that was being made on the Sabbath. A day that they were meant to take a day of rest, a day that was meant to be for worship, turned into a day of buying and selling goods. Here's Nehemiah's response. And starting in verse 17, it says, "I rebuked the nobles of Judah and said to them, 'What is this wicked thing you are doing, discrediting the Sabbath day? Didn't your forefathers do the same things so that our God brought all this calamity upon us and upon the city? Now you are stirring up more wrath against Israel by discrediting the Sabbath. This thing that they are doing, this evil thing. Other Bibles might use the word profane instead of what was it? And I'm sorry, I said discrediting. It's desecrating the Sabbath. That's on me. I'm sorry. So instead of desecrating the Sabbath, they might use the word profane the Sabbath, but it's referring to evil. It's referring to this evil thing, this selfish thing that they are doing. That they are spending more time buying and selling different items instead of using the day as a form of rest. Now, you know what you're probably thinking is, how could they do such a thing? One thing I want to ask is, what have we done on Sundays? Now, sure, it's Sunday and we're here at church, but what's also going on in the world? When we go home, we're going to be passing a lot of shops, a lot of restaurants, a lot of different businesses that are open on Sundays. In fact, Warren Wiersbe actually talked about this. He actually interviewed a manager at a shopping mall, asking him, like, how does it feel being open on a Sunday? The manager replied with this: I and the employees would rather be at home, but it's a big day for business, especially from the people who are on their way home from church. How often do we use Sunday as a day that it was meant to be, a day of rest, time to be with family, friends, or just praising our Lord? In fact, probably the majority of us here, when we go home, what are we going to watch on TV? If you're thinking the Bears lose again, you're probably right. There's so much more business, so much more buying and selling on Sundays today. Now, I understand there are some things that have to be open on Sundays, like a hospital. You can't tell people, "Oh, sorry, you can't be sick on Sundays." That's really tough to do. And I understand that with the police station, you got to make sure everyone is safe, make sure everyone's okay. Fire departments, those have to be open on Sundays. That just happens. Those places are even open on Christmas. And it's not anything against religion, it's not anything against Christ. It's got to be open. In fact, my grandfather, my dad's dad, he owned a pharmacy. He had to be open on Sundays. But since he owned the restaurant, he owned the pharmacy, he said, well, I'm going to change the store hours. And so he did not open the store until after church was done. So, in fact, my dad told me stories about when he was helping my grandfather in the shop. They would go to the shop before church, get everything all prepped and ready before they opened, go to church, listen to the service, and when it was done, go back to the pharmacy, open it up for a few hours. But it was not officially opened until after service was done. So continuing on after what Nehemiah has said, in verse 19, we see, when evening shadows fell on the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I ordered the doors to be shut and not opened until the Sabbath was over. I stationed some of my own men at the gates so that no load could be brought in on the Sabbath day. So a little context on how the Jews would view a day. Now, for us, we view it in terms of time. So we say, okay, from midnight to midnight, that's a day. So, or military time, it would be from 0 100 hours till 2,359 hours. That's one full day. So midnight to midnight. But in the Jewish context, and this is the same context that we're seeing here, is that the Sabbath, a particular day, does not start until Friday night at sundown. See, the Sabbath is Saturday. That's like the day that it's mostly celebrated on. But the Sabbath truly starts at sundown on Friday night. And so then Sabbath goes from Friday night at sundown to then Saturday at sundown. And so Saturday night, that's when the Sabbath is over. And so that's what Nehemiah is implementing here, that the gates were not meant to be opened until the Sabbath was over. And he stationed some of his own men to guard the gates, the people that he could trust. Starting verse 20. Once or twice, the merchants and sellers of all kinds of goods spent the night outside Jerusalem. But I warned them and said, why do you spend the night by the wall? If you do this again, I will lay hands on you. From that time on, they no longer came on the Sabbath. Then I commanded the Levites to purify themselves and go and guard the gates in order to keep the Sabbath day holy. So Nehemiah was seeing that these merchants, even though they were kicked out of the city, they were like, well, okay, well, we're outside the city walls, but we just want to be right here once the gates are opened. That way we can go in and we can go buy and sell goods. Like we won't bother anyone. But Nehemiah says, no, get out of here. We don't want you here. This is the Sabbath. This is the day of rest. Go away. In fact, he was so angry with them that he even said, I will lay hands on you. So he's getting physical. He's willing to get violent. And these merchants, these buyers and sellers, they were so afraid that they left. They're like, okay, Nehemiah, we'll leave. We're going to pack up and go far away. And at the very end of this section, we see another prayer from Nehemiah. It says, remember me for this also, oh my God, and show mercy to me according to your great love. Nehemiah is saying once again, Lord, please don't forget me. Remember me. Show mercy upon me. In referring to all the work that he has done, all the faithful work that he has done in the past. This was not meant to be selfish in terms of, Lord, look at all the work I did. It was not meant to be a boastful thing. It was not meant that my works gain salvation. It wasn't that at all. It was, Lord, just remember the faithful work I have done, to not blot me out, as we saw in the previous prayer. That Nehemiah was not going to be included with this rebellion, but that he was being faithful, that he was shown mercy. And yes, I wish this was the end of it, that there was no other issues. But there's one more. We see in the last section here of this chapter, the neglecting marriage. You see the people of Jerusalem neglecting marriage. This takes us from verse 23 all the way through 31, which says, moreover, in those days I saw men of Judah who had married women from Ashbad, Ammon, and Moab. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashbad, or the language of one of the other peoples, and did not know how to speak the language of Judah. I rebuked them and called curses down on them. I beat some of the men and pulled out their hair. I had them take an oath in God's name and said, you are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor are you to take their daughters in marriage for your sons or for themselves. Was it not because of marriages like these that Solomon, king of Israel, sinned? Among the many nations, there was no king like him. He was loved by his God, and God made him king over Israel. But even he was led into sin by foreign women. Must we hear now that you too are doing all this terrible wickedness and are being unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women? So we see that the people of Israel, they're marrying people from foreign lands, intermarrying with people of pagan nations. In fact, it's gotten so bad that these children, the people um, of these wrong marriages, did not speak the language of Judah, most likely Hebrew. They spoke the other languages of these other nations, these enemy nations, but not the language of the people. Now, if you remember back in Nehemiah chapter 8, where Nehemiah and Ezra had to translate the book of the law to the people of Jerusalem. Now, in that context, people had just come back from the 70 years of exile, so it's pretty reasonable on why they did not know Hebrew. But in this context, it was because they chose to disobey God. Now, I understand in today's culture, there are times where people like they marry people from a different culture. For example, Marjorie and I. Marjorie's Filipino, and I'm not. And and I'm not saying like that's wrong. I'm not saying that's sinful. Um, but in this particular context, people were marrying, like Jewish people were marrying people of pagan nations. With Marjorie and I, we are both Christians. We are both focused on following Christ. And the hard thing is the reason why Nehemiah wanted people to marry other Jewish people, for Jews to marry Jews, was to keep the history of the Jews alive, to keep those traditions alive, to keep the faith alive, to teach it to their children. Now, just because Marjorie and I are Christians does not automatically guarantee that Hadassah, our daughter, is a Christian. That's something she has to choose on her own. But it is our job as parents to teach her, to instruct her on Jesus, of who he is, on his love for us. But faith doesn't work like that. Just because it doesn't work in terms of my faith does not go into Hadassah. It doesn't work like that in terms of biology. Hadassah will have to make that decision on her own one day, which Marjorie and I have been praying that one day she does. And what's so sad with all these things that the people of Jerusalem have been doing, so we see they violated the temple, they neglected the temple, the tithing, they bought and sold goods on the Sabbath, and they married people that they were not supposed to marry. Now, if you remember back in Nehemiah chapter 10, that was when the people made an oath. They lamented, they repented of their sins, and they made an oath to God. Does anyone remember the three big things that they made an oath about? That they would tithe to the temple, that they would not buy and sell goods on the Sabbath, and they would not marry foreign people. And what do they do in this little chapter here? They violated that oath. It's so sad that just the little things that the world can do, the little influences that the world provides can change a nation. We saw last week how the people of Jerusalem, they were worshiping God so loud that it could be heard from far away. And now we're being told that they are neglecting the Lord. Completely 180 their attitude. And we close this section, the last few verses of this book, this study. We see Nehemiah praying once again. He says, "Remember them, oh my God, because they defiled the priestly office and the covenant of the priesthood and of the Levites." As in, remember them of what they did, the people that neglected the Lord, of what they did. But then also, verse 30, it says, "So I purified the priests and the Levites of everything foreign and assigned them duties, each his own task. I also made provision for contributions of wood at designated times and for the first fruits." So literally everything that he did in the past, everything that he did over the last several chapters, over nearly 12 years as a governor, that was his first stint. He left for some time, comes back, he had to do everything all over again. And he closes this book with his final prayer. He says, "Remember me with favor, oh my God." As we talked about, friends, Nehemiah has taken this personally. He doesn't want the people of Jerusalem to go into another exile. He doesn't want them to go through this same thing again, to be in exile for another 70 years. For the holy city, for the temple of the Lord to be destroyed again. And so he's praying to God, "Remember me with favor." As we saw in those other prayers, to remember him and his faithful work, dedicating to the Lord, his life, his time with the people of Jerusalem. So as we close out this series, what is our application? The first one is guard your heart. Guard your heart, friends. The people of the world want you to go away from Christ. But we must not be influenced by the world. We must not be influenced by the people around us. Guard our hearts. There will be temptations. There's going to be struggles in our lives. But we must guard our hearts, what is true, which is Jesus. These words that are given to us. The second application is to value obedience over convenience. I'm going to say that again. Value obedience over convenience. It's easy to do the easy thing, isn't it? Well, it's convenient. It's easy. It's right there. It's an option for you. But just because it's convenient does not mean it's the thing you should always do. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that obeying God is easy. But God calls us to obey him, to follow him, which means that we're going to be doing stuff that can be a little difficult. But we must value obedience to our Lord over the easy thing in our lives. And then finally, maintain your spiritual identity. When it's to guarding our hearts, to valuing obedience, it's not just a one-time thing. It's not just going to happen once in your life. It will happen several times in your life. So we must maintain our spiritual identity. And our identity is not in ourselves. Our identity is not in the things we do, the things we have. Our identity, our spiritual identity is in Christ. And we must maintain that. And the way we do that is to guard our hearts and to value obedience over convenience. Let's close in prayer.